The Imperial Japanese Navy, or IJN, entered the 20th century deeply committed to a single, overriding strategic concept called Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. This foundational belief dictated that the war would ultimately be won in one colossal, climactic naval engagement fought by fleets of heavily armed battleships. The doctrine was a direct response to Japan's geographical and economic realities, which necessitated a swift, knockout blow against any major opponent. It was inspired by the IJN's own stunning victory at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where Admiral Togo decisively annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet using classic battleship tactics. This history cemented the battleship as the supreme arbiter of naval power in the minds of the Japanese High Command for decades to come. The strategy assumed that the superior Japanese battleship fleet would draw out and destroy the American Pacific Fleet in a single engagement near the home islands, effectively ending the war in the Pacific before the United States could fully mobilize its massive industrial capacity. Every aspect of Japanese naval design, training, and strategic planning flowed from this unwavering concentration on the decisive, big-gun confrontation. Submarines, while present in the fleet, were relegated to the role of fleet scouts and escorts, primarily tasked with attacking enemy battleships just prior to the main engagement to soften them up for the primary surface fleet. Their potential for commerce raiding, a tactic that had proved devastating in World War I, was almost entirely ignored and actively dismissed as dishonorable and secondary. The IJN commanders viewed attacking defenseless merchant shipping as a distraction from the noble and necessary pursuit of the decisive fleet engagement. This dismissal was not merely a matter of outdated tradition but a profound strategic blind spot that would prove catastrophic. The doctrine of Kantai Kessen became a kind of military dogma, inflexible and almost religious in its adherence among the senior leadership. It drove the entire naval arms race in the Pacific, culminating in the design and construction of the world's largest, most powerful warships ever built, the ultimate manifestation of the battleship ideal. The massive resources poured into this single-minded focus on the great battle meant that other, equally vital aspects of naval warfare were neglected, specifically the protection of the vast sea lanes that connected the Japanese Empire. The idea that the enemy might employ a relentless, grinding war of attrition against their essential logistical network was never adequately considered or prepared for. This strategic oversight left the sprawling Japanese Empire, which was entirely dependent on overseas resources, fatally exposed to a campaign waged by an entirely different kind of vessel. The focus on a single, glorious moment of victory obscured the grim reality of a long war requiring constant logistical support and resource protection. The pinnacle of Japan's battleship doctrine was the construction of the Yamato class, which included the Yamato and the Musashi, the largest and most powerfully armed battleships ever to sail. These behemoths were the physical embodiment of the Kantai Kessen philosophy, built in secret and intended to be the ultimate trump card against the United States Navy. Their main armament consisted of 9 massive 18.1-inch guns, capable of firing shells weighing over 3,200 pounds to a distance of 26 miles, an unprecedented level of firepower. The Japanese believed that no American ship could withstand their concentrated broadside, and therefore, the ships guaranteed victory in the expected Great Battle. To counter American numerical superiority, the IJN planners banked on the individual superiority of their vessels, believing quality could overcome quantity. They were designed not just as warships, but as symbols of national pride and military invincibility, a psychological weapon intended to intimidate and deter. The massive scale of the Yamato required secret dockyards and ingenious construction techniques, highlighting the extreme level of commitment to this single class of vessel. Building these two ships consumed an enormous fraction of Japan's finite industrial and material resources, including vast quantities of steel and oil. These resources might have been better allocated to producing more aircraft carriers, escort destroyers, or, crucially, anti-submarine warfare vessels. Even after the start of the war, when the vulnerability of battleships to air power was shockingly demonstrated, the belief in the big gun remained stubbornly ingrained. The High Command saw the battleship as the primary weapon, and the aircraft carrier was often relegated to merely scouting or protecting the more important capital ships. This adherence to the battleship idea meant that naval aviation, despite its proven ability to sink any surface warship, was never given the doctrinal supremacy it deserved. Training emphasized complex fleet maneuvers centered around the main battle line, neglecting the mundane but essential skills required for convoy protection and anti-submarine defense. Many of Japan's best commanders and engineers were drawn into the battleship program, diverting intellectual capital from developing crucial technologies like radar or sonar, areas where the Allies would gain a decisive edge. The Yamato and its sister ship were often kept in reserve, becoming a fleet in being, meant to intimidate the enemy with their mere existence and only to be unleashed in the final, decisive moment. This preservation instinct kept them from the early, crucial battles where they might have provided some value, leaving them as massive, expensive white elephants. Their tremendous fuel consumption further exacerbated Japan's already dire oil shortages, making their deployment a major logistical event. The immense scale of the battleship program, which prioritized two singular weapon systems over the needs of the wider fleet, laid the groundwork for the logistics disaster that was to come. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was a stunning, carrier-led tactical masterstroke that instantly redefined naval warfare worldwide. Japanese carriers, not their battleships, delivered the crushing initial blow, sinking or damaging numerous American battleships and effectively crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Yet, in a bizarre twist of fate, this phenomenal success, executed by their own air arm, did not fundamentally shatter the IJN's core belief in the battleship doctrine. The absence of the American aircraft carriers from Pearl Harbor was a missed opportunity that naval planners lamented, as they still yearned for a surface engagement. Japanese commanders still largely viewed the aircraft carrier as a mere instrument to clear the way for the ultimate decisive clash of the battleships. The first 6 months of the war saw Japan achieve almost total domination across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, driven by a highly effective combination of carrier air power and highly trained air crews. However, the rapid expansion of the Japanese Empire also created an impossibly large defensive perimeter that stretched their limited resources to the breaking point. The great distances involved meant a corresponding increase in the number of merchant ships and oil tankers required to sustain the frontline troops and bases. The psychological adherence to Kantai-Kessen meant that these vital supply lines were treated as an afterthought, left largely unprotected and vulnerable. The turning point came at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, where the U.S. Navy sank 4 of Japan's best fleet carriers in a single, brutal engagement. This sudden and catastrophic loss should have immediately triggered a massive, systemic overhaul of Japanese naval doctrine and production priorities. Instead, the response was to treat it as a temporary setback, a fluke, or a failure of operational security rather than a fundamental flaw in their strategic thinking. The shipbuilding program for battleships was only slightly curtailed, while the production of escort ships and aircraft remained insufficient to cover the losses. The IJN's core remained convinced that once the American fleet was weakened enough, the final, inevitable battleship duel would still take place and secure the final victory. This refusal to learn the correct lesson from their own victories and defeats locked the Japanese into a death spiral of obsolescent planning. They continued to build and deploy their few remaining capital ships with extreme caution, still preserving them for the great battle that was becoming increasingly less likely to happen. By stubbornly clinging to the dream of a single, decisive moment, the Japanese leadership failed to prepare for the long, grinding, industrial war of attrition that the United States was uniquely positioned to wage. The stage was set for the United States to attack the single most critical, yet most neglected, vulnerability of the entire Japanese war machine, its lifeline on the sea. While Japan obsessed over creating the perfect battleship, the United States was quietly cultivating a powerful and effective submarine fleet, which would become the most potent weapon in the Pacific War. The U.S. Navy had a much more flexible and pragmatic view of submarine warfare, recognizing its potential for both reconnaissance and, critically, commerce raiding. At the start of the war, the U.S. submarine force was primarily composed of the capable Gato-class submarines, vessels that were modern, highly seaworthy, and possessed excellent range. Their captains were granted a high degree of independence in their patrol areas, a stark contrast to the IJN's centralized and rigid command structure. However, the American submarine fleet initially struggled, plagued by severe technical deficiencies that hampered their combat effectiveness. Their primary weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo, was a deeply flawed device, suffering from poor depth control, unreliability, and a faulty magnetic exploder that often caused the torpedoes to pass harmlessly beneath their targets or fail to detonate. This forced submariners to risk their lives repeatedly, firing perfectly aimed shots only to watch them fail to achieve the necessary kill. Many months of the war were essentially wasted while the crews themselves, rather than the naval bureaucracy, performed the necessary, dangerous work to diagnose and correct the flaws. This self-correction, born of necessity and the independent nature of the submarine captains, eventually led to the fleet's transformation into a deadly, highly efficient killing machine. By late 1943, with the technical issues largely resolved, the Mark 14 and its successors became the reliable, devastating weapons they were intended to be. The submarines were supported by a massive industrial base that continuously produced new boats and provided rapid overhauls and resupply at forward bases like Pearl Harbor and Australia. New boats poured out of American shipyards at a rate that Japan could never hope to match, ensuring a constant, relentless presence in the vital shipping lanes. The primary target of this rapidly improving force was not the Japanese battle fleet, which was proving elusive, but the unglamorous, slow-moving merchant vessels. This decision to focus on the enemy's logistics was a brilliant strategic move, representing a complete reversal of the IJN's own misplaced priorities. The American submarine force, operating silently beneath the waves, was perfectly positioned to exploit Japan's single most profound strategic weakness. They would soon demonstrate that the war would not be won by sinking battleships but by destroying the oil and food that kept the Japanese war machine and its nation alive. The initial phase of the American submarine campaign was marked by high frustration and limited success, a direct result of the deeply flawed Mark 14 torpedo. American submariners were skilled and aggressive, but they were betrayed by their own technology, leading to missed opportunities and lost ships. Reports of torpedoes failing to explode or running too deep were initially dismissed by the Bureau of Ordnance, a prime example of institutional inertia. Submarine commanders were forced to undertake their own covert testing, firing live torpedoes at cliff faces and submerged nets to prove their ordnance was defective. It took the extreme risks and persistent reporting of men like Admiral Charles Lockwood, the commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, to finally force the necessary fixes. The depth charge issue was eventually corrected by field testing, adjusting the sensitive hydrostats that regulated the torpedo's running depth. The critical exploder flaw, which required a contact hit to reliably detonate, was circumvented only after the magnetic mechanism was disabled by the crews themselves. The persistence required to fix this fundamental defect highlights the determination of the American submariners, who refused to accept a faulty weapon. Concurrently with fixing their weapons, American tactics were evolving rapidly, moving away from single-boat patrols toward coordinated wolf-pack attacks. These wolf-packs, inspired by the German U-boat tactics in the Atlantic, allowed multiple submarines to overwhelm the meager defenses of Japanese convoys. The U.S. Navy also pioneered the use of effective radar and improved sonar, giving their boats a decisive edge in locating and tracking surface targets, especially at night. The ability to accurately detect targets from a distance, even in poor visibility, meant that American submarines could strike with stealth and precision. In contrast, the Japanese anti-submarine defenses were rudimentary, often relying on obsolete equipment and poorly trained crews. Japanese sonar was inferior, and their escort ships lacked the speed and maneuverability to effectively counter the modern American boats. The IJN's failure to develop a comprehensive anti-submarine doctrine, again due to their focus on the decisive battle, left their shipping lanes wide open. This combination of American technological refinement and Japanese doctrinal neglect created the perfect environment for a devastating campaign of economic warfare. The U.S. sub-fleet transitioned from a hampered force to a highly proficient, silent killer in the span of just 2 years, ready to execute their devastating new mission. Immediately following the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt authorized the U.S. Navy to conduct unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. This decision meant that all Japanese vessels, regardless of whether they were warships, troop transports, or unarmed merchant ships, were considered legitimate targets. It was a cold, calculated strategic move that mirrored the German U-boat campaigns and recognized Japan's overwhelming reliance on seaborne commerce. The sheer geographical distance between Japan and its newly conquered resource territories, such as the oil fields of Borneo and the rubber plantations of Malaya, was the vulnerability the U.S. sought to exploit. The U.S. submarine force was ordered to concentrate their efforts on the targets of opportunity, which overwhelmingly meant the unescorted or poorly defended cargo and tanker fleets. The goal was not merely to sink ships but to systematically dismantle the economic foundation upon which the entire Japanese empire was built. The primary hunting grounds became the South China Sea, the approaches to the Philippines, and the East China Sea, all vital bottlenecks in Japan's resource network. These areas saw an almost constant American submarine presence, with boats rotating in and out of patrol zones to maintain relentless pressure on Japanese logistics. The sheer volume of successful attacks slowly began to create a critical, unrecoverable shortage of shipping capacity for the Japanese. Every merchant ship sunk meant less food for the home islands, less raw material for the factories, and, most importantly, less oil for the fleet. This strategy of economic strangulation was a stark contrast to the IJN's focus on a single, glorious battle. It was a slow, grinding, and utterly devastating war of attrition. The losses mounted day by day, month by month, each sinking a small, unglamorous victory that collectively chipped away at the Empire's ability to wage war. The U.S. submariners quickly became the true spearhead of the Pacific War effort, quietly doing the essential, dirty work that air and surface fleets could not accomplish. Their success lay in their invisibility and their persistence, turning the vast Pacific Ocean from a lifeline for Japan into its watery grave. Japan's fatal strategic error was its failure to develop and implement a comprehensive and effective system for protecting its vital merchant shipping. The deep-seated belief that the war would be decided by battleships led to the complete neglect of anti-submarine warfare, which was seen as a low-priority task. When the war began, the Japanese Navy did not even have a dedicated naval command structure for convoy operations, unlike their German and American counterparts. Merchant vessels were often left to sail individually or in small, uncoordinated groups, making them easy prey for the organized American wolf packs. The handful of escort ships available, mostly older destroyers and coastal patrol vessels, were too few in number and often lacked modern sonar and radar equipment. Furthermore, the IJN failed to adequately train the crews of these escort vessels in the complex coordination and tactical movements required for effective convoy protection. The concept of using aircraft to provide aerial cover for convoys, which proved vital in the Atlantic, was also woefully underdeveloped and underutilized in the Pacific. Many of Japan's best pilots and aircraft were perpetually tied up in defending major fleet units or participating in offensive operations, never assigned to the thankless task of convoy escort. The Japanese shipbuilding industry, optimized for building large warships and aircraft, struggled to transition to the mass production of smaller, standardized escort frigates and corvettes. This meant that as shipping losses mounted, the ability to replace the sunken merchant ships and simultaneously build adequate protection fell further and further behind. The commanders of the Imperial Japanese Army, who depended entirely on these sea lanes for supplies and reinforcements, often clashed bitterly with the Navy over escort allocations. These inter-service rivalries further complicated and hampered any attempt to create a unified and efficient system of resource protection. As a result, by 1944, a vast swathe of the Japanese-controlled ocean became a free-fire zone for American submarines. The sheer volume of unprotected targets meant that U.S. submarine captains could often fire a full salvo of torpedoes, score multiple hits, and escape without ever being detected. This sustained vulnerability meant that Japan was bleeding resources at a rate that its industrial base and natural reserves simply could not sustain for long. The relentless American submarine campaign achieved its primary goal, the total strangulation of Japan's ability to import the critical resources necessary to continue the war. Japan was almost entirely dependent on overseas imports for its essential needs, lacking sufficient domestic reserves of oil, iron ore, bauxite, and rubber. The most crucial material was oil, particularly the high-grade crude required to fuel the heavy cruisers and battleships that were still being preserved for the decisive battle. The majority of this oil came from the Dutch East Indies, requiring long and dangerous voyages through American submarine patrol areas. The sinking of tankers created an immediate and irreparable crisis for the Japanese military, forcing a severe rationing of fuel for all branches. The lack of oil meant that training missions for new pilots and sailors had to be drastically curtailed, reducing the quality and effectiveness of replacement personnel. The grand, mighty battleships, the very ships meant to decide the war, were often forced to sit idle in port due to a lack of fuel to move them. Beyond oil, the destruction of cargo shipping led to severe shortages of iron ore for steel production, bauxite for aluminum, and rubber for tires and gaskets. Factories on the home islands began to shut down or operate at severely reduced capacity because the raw materials they needed simply could not be delivered. The production of new aircraft, tanks, and ammunition was crippled by the inability to sustain the supply chain from the conquered territories. Even the food supply for the civilian population was drastically reduced, leading to widespread hunger and a corresponding drop in industrial productivity and morale. This systemic resource crisis had a far more profound and lasting impact than any single surface battle could have achieved. It was an invisible defeat, a slow-motion catastrophe that ensured that by the time the massive battleships were finally committed to action, they were sailing on fumes and operating with poorly trained crews. The oil shortage alone ensured that the Imperial Japanese Navy, the pride of the empire, was effectively paralyzed before the final, great engagements even took place. The American submariners quickly recognized that the highest value targets were not the few, well-defended warships but the incredibly vulnerable oil tankers. These tankers, often sailing alone or with minimal escort, were the literal lifeblood of the Japanese war effort, making their destruction an immediate strategic priority. The successful sinking of a single large tanker could cripple the fuel supply of an entire Japanese naval base or the operations of a fleet unit for months. Submarine patrol areas were specifically designated to intercept the tanker routes from Borneo and Sumatra to the Japanese home islands and forward bases. The tactic was simple yet devastating: stalk the slow, deep-drafted tankers and fire full spreads of reliable torpedoes to ensure a catastrophic, unrecoverable hit. The resulting explosions, particularly of oil and aviation fuel cargoes, were often spectacular and served as a grim testament to the success of the campaign. The loss of these vessels was particularly acute because tankers are specialized ships that take much longer to build than standard dry cargo transports. Japan's industrial base could not replace the sunken tankers fast enough, leading to a permanent, widening deficit in critical fuel transport capacity. This situation became so desperate that the Japanese military resorted to using converted cargo ships and even small coastal vessels to attempt to ferry oil, making them targets too. The systematic annihilation of Japan's tanker fleet effectively doomed the Imperial Navy to inaction, turning their mighty battleships into immobile floating fortresses. By mid-1944, the majority of the remaining Japanese fleet was forced to relocate to anchorages near the oil sources in Southeast Asia, unable to risk the long, fuel-consuming voyage home. This self-imposed strategic exile separated the fleet from the main operational and repair bases on the home islands, further degrading their combat readiness. The U.S. submarine campaign's laser focus on the tanker fleet was the single most decisive action that neutralized the power of the Japanese surface fleet without ever engaging the battleships directly. The fate of the mighty Yamato was sealed not by an enemy battleship, but by the absence of the fuel required to send her to sea, a direct result of the relentless work of the submarine force. The moment of truth for Japan's battleship doctrine arrived in October 1944 at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history. Japan committed nearly all of its remaining surface fleet in a complex, last-ditch effort to disrupt the American invasion of the Philippines. In this massive battle, the two remaining Yamato-class battleships, the Yamato and the Musashi, were finally unleashed, yet their impact was negligible. The Musashi was sunk before she could even reach the main battle area, destroyed by a relentless, overwhelming attack from U.S. carrier aircraft. The battleship was hit by at least 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, proving conclusively that even the largest capital ship was utterly defenseless without air cover. The Yamato saw action during the Battle off Samar, where it briefly engaged lightly armored American escort carriers and destroyers in a chaotic surface action. Despite their massive guns, the Japanese fleet's coordinated fire was poor, missing the opportunity to annihilate the desperate American force. The primary reason for the battleships' ineffectiveness was not their inherent flaw as weapons, but the complete lack of intelligence, communication, and air cover. The aircraft carriers, which should have been protecting them, had already been destroyed or neutralized, largely thanks to earlier submarine action and air combat losses. The battleships were committed to the battle with severely depleted fuel reserves, which limited their maneuverability and tactical options. More fundamentally, the battle itself was dictated by the movement of aircraft carriers and the logistical needs of the land invasion, not by a pre-planned battleship duel. The age of the battleship as the decisive weapon had passed, and Leyte Gulf served as its spectacular, conclusive funeral. The massive, heavily armored ships were slow, visible, and easily targeted by aircraft, transforming from a strategic asset into a liability. The campaign to sink the merchant fleet had already rendered the battleships irrelevant long before they ever fired a shot in their supposed decisive battle. The final, symbolic act of the battleship era for Japan was Operation Tengo in April 1945, the one-way suicide mission of the battleship Yamato. By this point, the Japanese Empire was in ruins, its navy decimated, and its logistical network completely severed by the U.S. submarine campaign. The Yamato, with a small escort of light cruisers and destroyers, was ordered to steam to Okinawa and beach itself, acting as a massive, unsinkable shore battery. The mission was purely one of national honor and defiance, universally recognized by the participants as a desperate, pointless sacrifice. The entire task force was provided with only enough fuel for a one-way trip, a stark and tragic indicator of the success of the American submarines oil war. American intelligence quickly detected the fleet, and a massive strike force of nearly 400 carrier aircraft was dispatched to intercept the lone battleship. The Yamato was subjected to a continuous and overwhelming assault by American bombers and torpedo planes for hours. The attack was a clinical demonstration of the vulnerability of even the mightiest battleship to concentrated air power, a lesson the IJN had refused to learn. American pilots were specifically ordered to target the ship's vulnerable sides with torpedoes, aiming for maximum flooding below the waterline. The Yamato finally capsized and exploded in a massive, mushroom cloud eruption that was visible for over 100 miles. Her sinking took with her over 3,000 men and effectively marked the final extinction of the battleship as a viable weapon of modern warfare. The loss of the Yamato, the ultimate expression of the decisive battle doctrine, was not a strategic defeat but the final confirmation of a strategic failure years in the making. The American fleet did not need battleships to sink the Yamato, they needed only the air power that their own intact logistics, unthreatened by any Japanese submarine counter-campaign, allowed them to project. The ultimate irony was that the Yamato was sunk primarily due to a shortage of fuel and a lack of air cover, both directly attributable to the successful, silent war waged by American submarines against Japanese supply lines. The history of the Pacific War is often told through the dramatic surface clashes and epic carrier duels, yet the true strategic victory was won by the U.S. submarine force. The total number of warships sunk by American submarines, including an impressive tally of 1 battleship, for fleet carriers, and numerous cruisers, was significant but not the full story. The enduring legacy is the systematic, total destruction of the Japanese merchant fleet, which was the final, decisive blow to the empire's ability to fight. By the end of the war, American submarines had sunk over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, accounting for more than 55% of all Japanese shipping losses. This amounted to roughly 5.3 million tons of shipping sent to the bottom of the Pacific, a loss that proved utterly unrecoverable for the resource-poor nation. The campaign effectively starved the Japanese war machine of its necessary oil, iron, and food, turning the once sprawling empire into a logistical impossibility. The U.S. submarine force, comprising only a fraction of the total naval personnel, achieved this strategic victory while suffering the highest casualty rate of any U.S. service branch. Their success was a testament to the tactical flexibility, technological development, and pragmatic strategic thinking that stood in sharp contrast to the IJN's rigid adherence to outdated doctrine. The war was ultimately won not in a glorious clash of battleships, the event that Japan had prepared for decades to fight, but in the dark, silent depths of the ocean. The Imperial Japanese Navy, with its dream of the decisive battle, was undone by a slow, unseen process of economic strangulation, proving that logistics, not firepower, is the true master of war. The sinkings ensured that when the final battles came, the Japanese fleet was sailing on empty tanks, protected by inadequate escorts, and crewed by poorly trained men. The submarines had already won the war long before the surrender was signed, turning the great battleships into historical footnotes and monuments to a tragically misplaced doctrine. The story of the Yamato is a poignant reminder that even the most powerful weapon is useless when its nation's lifeblood is being silently drained beneath the waves.